morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest of our FrenchEntrée webinars. My name is Zoe Smith. I'm digital editor of FrenchEntrée, and in today's webinar, we're going to be covering everything you need to know about buying a house in France. I'm joined today by a panel of 4 experts from our partners at Leggett, International Private Finance, Ashton's Legal, and Moneycorp, and I will introduce you to all of them in just a moment. Before we get started today, we are recording today's webinar and it will be available to stream for free over on our website and also over on our FrenchEntrée YouTube channel. We're also streaming live to Facebook this morning, so welcome to anyone who is watching us over there. For those of you that aren't familiar with FrenchEntrée, we are part of the France Media Group, who are specialist publishers covering all aspects of French life and culture, from travel to gastronomy to buying property. FrenchEntrée itself has been a leading resource for French property buyers for almost 20 years now. Not only do we help buyers to find their dream property in France, we also help and advise with every aspect of the property buying and moving to France journey. Now, if you are looking to buy a property in France, you may also be interested in our French Property News magazine, which you can subscribe to over on the FrenchEntrée website. And whilst you're there, you can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter and sign up to become a FrenchEntrée member, which gives you free access to our full property database. Another exciting date for the diary is our French property exhibition, which will be held in London in January next year. This is a really great opportunity to come and meet us all in person, browse thousands of French properties, and attend seminars from a wide range of industry leaders and experts on subjects relating to buying in France, moving to France, including tax, legal, financial, visas, healthcare, currency exchange, and lots more. Entry is free, and you can register for tickets on FrenchEntrée.com or FrenchPropertyExhibition.com. And if you want more information on any of the things I've just mentioned, you can head either to the FrenchEntrée website or drop us an email at webinar@FrenchEntrée.com. So let's jump into today's Buying a House in France webinar. We're aiming for a runtime of around 90 minutes today, and each of our speakers are going to give a short presentation, after which I'll be putting some of your questions to them. We'll also be conducting a couple of quick polls throughout, and we will have some extra time at the end for more questions, so do make sure you stick around until the end of the webinar. You can put your questions in the Q&A box on your screen at any time throughout, and if you're watching this on Facebook, you can leave a comment and one of my colleagues will pick that up. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel of experts, and a huge thank you to all of them for kindly giving up their time to join us this morning. If I could ask you to all turn your cameras on now. Good morning, everyone. So first up today will be Joanna Leggett from Leggett Estate Agents, who's going to offer some insight into the current French property market. Next, we'll have Fiona Watts from International Private Finance, who's going to talk us through your options for financing your purchase and getting a French mortgage. Following Fiona, we'll have Matthew Cameron from Ashton's Legal, who has all the need-to-know information on French property law, inheritance law, and taxes. And last but definitely not least, we have Mar Bonin-Palmer from currency exchange specialist Moneycorp, who will have some expert advice for you on securing the best currency exchange rate when buying in France. So that's more than enough from me. Let's go straight over to our first speaker, which is Joanna Leggett from Leggett Estate Agents. Over to you, Joanna.
Hello, and thank you, and welcome everybody. So I'm Joanna Leggett from Leggett Immobilier. We're based in France. We've been established since 1998, so we've got a lot of experience in the French property market, 22 years. Our role, we are estate agents, so a real estate agent, so we're actually based in France. We have over 700 agents now all over France in all areas, so we're here, we have a lot of local knowledge. And the great thing about ourselves is, obviously we're actually estate agents, so we all live and work in France, so we're not a portal. So all of the properties that you see listed on our site, you can actually physically talk to the person that has been in the house and lives in the area, so they can give you some really good local knowledge. We offer a hand-holding service, so we have a sales support team that can help you look and search for properties, find the right property for you, arrange all the viewings, and we will accompany you on all of those. We work alongside the notaire, so we have a contracts team that can draw up the compromis de vente, and we also work with the solicitors if you're using an English or an English established solicitor as well. We can work alongside them. We cover all areas and all budgets. So we have from small renovation projects to small barns to huge chateaus or new build developments or hotels. We cover commercial and equestrian as well. If we don't have a property and on the site that you can't find, we will actually have a hand-holding service which actually will go out and work with other agencies to try and find your property as well. But from start to finish, we're here to help. And so do come and talk to us, give us your criteria, and we will hopefully be able to help you. The property market at the moment is extremely strong. There were 1.2 million sales last year in France. Unfortunately, this means that prices in some areas have gone up. COVID has affected this as well, with people looking to move to the countryside. So we're seeing a lot of people move out of cities into the countryside. So where properties could have been on the market for 6 months to a year, that is changing, and we're seeing offers coming in, you know, from maybe 2 or 3 buyers within a few weeks of properties coming onto the market, particularly if they're well priced. So my suggestion would be, if you are looking at a property, go and speak to your mortgage experts, speak to your currency people, speak to everybody beforehand and get all your sort of ducks in a row, so that when you do come out to France and you do find the property that's your dream home, you're ready to be able to put in an offer, because it is quite a tough market at the moment. It's a seller's market, unfortunately for us buyers, and everything's moving quite quickly. But France is a fantastic place to live, so welcome all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Lots of really good advice there for people looking to buy in France. Right, we're going to put a few frequently asked questions to Joanna, and we will also have some time at the end to put more questions to her. So do keep them coming. I know lots of you have put them already in the Q&A box, so that's great. So first up, what advice would you give to house hunters when organizing a property viewing trip to France?
Well, the first thing I would say is to obviously do your research, because France is the biggest country in Western Europe, which means that, you know, the area is huge. And I think some of the mistakes that people make is, for example, they'll say, oh, we want to look at these 3 properties in the Dordogne in a day, but the Dordogne can be 2.5 hours long from one end to the other. So it's, you know, speaking to our call centre, our sales support team, they know the distances. So I definitely plan well. I try not to see too many properties in one day, because they'll all become one and you'll forget what was what. And also, if, say, for example, you're coming for a week to view properties or a weekend, give yourself at least a day off, that if you found a property that you really like, you can go back and look at the village, look at village life, look at the market, see what's going on, get an idea about the lifestyle, because there'll be perfect homes in any area of France. But if you're going to be living there permanently or even on holiday, you want to make sure that it's a, you know, it's a nice area. So give yourself some time. Don't try and cram in huge amounts of properties to view. Give yourself some time to look at the area and do your research in the areas of the properties that you like.
Brilliant. And what advice would you give to second homeowners looking to sell their home in France right now?
Well, selling is a very good time at the moment, because the property market in France is moving so quickly that there is a huge lack of stock. So if you are looking to sell, now is a very, very good time. The property market is at a peak. I'm not sure whether it will stay like that in the following year. But again, the other thing to remember is, if you're looking to get a good price, the unfortunate thing is a lot of people put a lot of money into their property. They might not realize the renovation costs, and they expect to get back what they put in, but there is a ceiling on every property. So look at what's available in your area when you're pricing, get some good estimations from some good local agents, and then again, if it's a holiday home, for example, make sure that you've been over and had a look at it, because the grass grows, or as the moment it's so hot the grass is burnt, you know. So have a look at what the property looks like. Make sure you do all those loose ends, because little loose ends to you may not be for a buyer. So, you know, if you've got a plug hanging off the wall, or, you know, the front door needs painting, get all of those things done so that it has great curb appeal when potential buyers are coming to look at it. But as I say, it is a very, very good time to put your house on the market because things are selling very, very quickly, and we don't have enough stock. That is an issue.
Great. Okay, and what options are available in France for new build or investment properties?
There's lots of it, obviously loads of opportunities. A lot of the new build tends to be in cities. So if you're looking at buying in a city, then obviously you'd be looking at areas like Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, some of the cities that there are available, and the Alps in particular. The Alps is very, very good for investment because you have all year round rental for holiday rentals, which is a slightly higher premium than you would if you were just renting out generally, because the season is so much longer. You have the summer season in some resorts like Chamonix, for example, there are more tourists visiting in the summer months than actually in the ski season. There's a huge amount of new development going on in the Alps, areas like Paris, which is extremely good for investment. It depends on what you want. We have a lot of Americans that will buy in Paris, for example, great areas. But then with new build, you miss the historical factor with France, which is so beautiful because there's so many beautiful historical buildings, but new build is still very good. You have the choice then. People like new build, they have nothing to do. You can move straight in, you can choose your tiling, you can choose your electrics, etc. So that's always a good investment as well. I'd also say if you're thinking of building yourself a new build, there are huge amounts of great grants available in France, so it's worth looking into that as well. You can buy a plot of land, again check with somebody like Matthew for a solicitor or a notaire to make sure that there is planning permission allowed on that piece of land. It would usually come with CU, and then if you build new, there are lots of available grants for it's particularly things for insulation, electricity, anything that's very green. France is a very green country, so if you're looking at building new yourself for investment, there's lots of opportunities there as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that advice, Joanna. And we'll come back to Joanna again with more questions at the end. So before we go over to our next speaker, I'm going to put the first of our polls up on the screen. Let me just find that for you now. Here we go. All right. That should be going up now. So the question is, when are you looking to purchase in France? As soon as possible, within the next 6 months, within the next year, or are you still in the dreaming phase? I'll give you just a little bit more time to answer. It looks like people are answering very quickly. You're all on the ball this morning. It's good to see. Okay. Almost there. A few of you still left to vote, so I'll give you a few more seconds to do that. Looks like we're about there. Okay, right. I'm going to end this poll. I'm going to put the results up for you on the screen. So it looks like the majority of you are looking within the next year. Okay, still quite a few looking more as soon as possible and within the next 6 months. And there's still a fair few of you who are still in the dreaming phase. And this is a good place to be if you are, because we'll be able to fill you in on all the information you need to know to decide whether that's a good idea for you or not. Right. Okay, well, let's go over to our next speaker, which is Fiona Watts from International Private Finance. So over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Zoe. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to bring my presentation up onto the screen so that you can see that. Okay, brilliant. So just as a note of introduction, I'm Fiona. I'm the Managing Director and founder of International Private Finance. We were established in 2008 and we specialise in arranging finance for our clients that are looking to primarily buy a holiday home in France. Our team are bilingual and we are established both in the UK and France. So I thought today I would focus on the main questions that we get asked by our clients. Based on the poll and the majority of people not buying sort of for some time or within the next year, the key thing I really want to say is how quickly this market changes. And I would recommend really touching base and coming back to us closer to you finding a property, because it really does change quite dramatically. If I was talking to you this time last year, my answers would be quite different. So just to really caveat there that the market does change, and it's well worth making sure you're coming back to us and seeing how that impacts you. So I'm going to cover how much can I borrow, and where do you go to get a French mortgage, what sort of products are available, what paperwork would you need to provide, and how long would the process take. So if we take the first one, how much can I borrow? That's the key question we get asked, and people trying to establish their budget before they go out and view properties. The calculation in France is very different to the UK. It's often sort of referred to as the 1/3 rule. It's essentially your ability to service the mortgage. So the way that they calculate whether or not you can get a mortgage in France, or how much you can borrow, they look at your income and they look at your outgoings. So if a client were to be earning £3,000 a month, then £1,000, 1/3 of that, can be taken up with the repayment of your new mortgage, your existing mortgage, any car finance or any personal loans. So as you can see, it's significantly more cautious than in the UK. It does vary from bank to bank and what income they can take into account, but it's a very rough rule of thumb you can use. We have mortgage calculators on our website, so feel free to go in and put your income in and you'll get a very rough idea. The next point we often are asked is it possible to get a mortgage based on the future rental income that they're going to be receiving? Because lots of our clients plan to rent the property out, and when they're not there, just like Joanna said, Chamonix and some of those resorts in the Alps are really year round, and people don't want to be there for too long, so want to be able to rent it out when they're not using it. You absolutely can do that. There is no reduction in loan to value like we're used to here. The rate can be slightly less competitive, but often it's exactly the same. But the key difference is that you can't use the future rental income to obtain the mortgage. It has to be based on your current income that you have. The third point that I want to mention is how you're going to cover the remaining amount that you can't borrow. So you need to have the cash to cover the deposit. You need to have the cash to cover the buying costs in France. And the banks also want to see that you've got some money left over. And so that's really critical in determining your budget. And one of the key differences with the UK is that money can't be borrowed or gifted to you. You can't raise that money against your UK property. Your parents can't give it to you. So really make sure that the source of that is going to be something that's not going to cause problems with the mortgage, because that's probably one of the most common reasons that we see mortgage applications refused when people try and apply to a bank directly. Next, I wanted to talk about where can I get a French mortgage. So it's very different to the UK. There aren't hundreds of banks lending to people buying a second home in France, and you don't know the banks, you don't have very much history in France in terms of your income and your outgoings. So it's very difficult for a French bank to determine the affordability and the risk. And for that reason, far fewer of them do it. So it needs to be a specialist French bank. They generally need to be French because they have to adhere to the rules in France in terms of taking security over the French property. So it tends to be French banks. Lots of people say, can I not go to a UK bank and therefore use UK lending rules? You can't. If you're lending against a property in France, you have to adhere to the rules. So they generally all have that 1/3 rule that they have to adhere to. The most common banks lending to the non-residents are actually the French retail banks, and they'll have specialist non-resident departments specifically for clients that are looking to buy a second home abroad that don't have documentation in French, with underwriters and people on the credit committee that are very used to British income. There are more specialist lenders, but I'm not going to go into that today. It's just if you don't fall into that category, there are other options as well that we can look at. What products are available? So the products are quite different to the UK, where we're very used to taking short-term fixed rates and changing providers or products every few years. That isn't how it works in France. You get a mortgage for the life of the loan. So the advantage is you could get a rate that's fixed for 20 years. Another advantage is you're not having to go through the refinance process every few years. So from that side, you're not having to change lenders and pay the fees again. But it does mean it's really important to get the mortgage product right from the start. There are repayment and interest-only mortgages, interest-only being far less common than we're used to here and not available to French people living and working in France. Loan-to-values tend to go up to 85% as a maximum. There are some banks that will go to a higher loan-to-value, but only if you place that equivalent amount with them. So the true loan-to-value really that's available is 85%. And I've given you a rough idea there of rates and what they currently are. And as I said, that will alter, but they're currently fixed at that sort of rate for 20-25 years. Coming on to paperwork, it's very paperwork heavy, as is everything in France, and the mortgage is no different. Again, as I've mentioned, the banks can do very limited checks on you in the UK, so they want to have proof of everything. I've listed there the main areas, but to give you an idea of proof of income, if you're salaried, you'd need a letter from your employer, 3 months worth of pay slips, and your last 2 P60s just to prove your income. So here in the UK, we're used to providing minimal income to get a mortgage. And equally, we only provide information on what we feel is relevant. In France, they don't just want a snapshot, they really want to get a feel of your whole situation to be able to assess the mortgage. So it isn't just enough to show the bank account with the savings in that you're going to use with a French mortgage. They want to see the whole picture, even funds that you have set aside not to spend on the French property. So I've given you a list there of some of the key paperwork and documents that you're going to need to provide. And the key question we get is, how long is the whole process going to take? So this is a difficult one for us to answer. The standard buying process in France is 3 months. And in that sales contract, you're normally allowed 2 months in which to get a mortgage offer. In France, generally, you're not allowed to apply to a bank until you've signed that initial sales contract. That makes it very difficult for both agents and vendors to feel reassured that you're actually going to be able to get a mortgage. So that's where I would really recommend speaking to a broker, a specialist like us, and making sure you're clear on your budget. Due to the sheer volume of mortgages that we arrange, we do have arrangements with banks where we can get you an initial approval ahead of you signing that sales contract, but it's quite rare. So you really want to do all of your homework beforehand, so someone like us can have a look at your paperwork and your situation and be as confident as we can be that the mortgage is going to be approved. And that's the end. So Zoe, I'll pass back over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. I think that'll be really useful for anyone who's wondering whether a French mortgage is an option for you. Fiona, if I can just, perfect. I was going to ask you to stop sharing your screen, but she's already on it. I'm now going to put a few frequently asked questions to Fiona. So the first one, just bring them up. How has Brexit affected Brits when it comes to getting a mortgage in France?
Yes, that's something that our clients ask us very frequently. So following Brexit, the banks have essentially wanted clients to fall into one of 2 categories to feel comfortable lending. The first of which is that a client would need to be a high net worth borrower as defined by the FCA. And that is someone that is earning over £150,000 net per annum and or has assets of 500,000, and that's net assets. So after any mortgages on your properties in the UK. If you fall into that category, you'd simply have a high net worth statement you need to complete and sign. The second category is if you're planning to rent the property out more than you're planning to use it. So for anyone that's resident in the UK, regardless of your nationality, you have to fall into one of those 2 categories to be able to get a French mortgage.
Okay. And will I be able to get a French mortgage in my 60s?
Yes, this is one of the areas where actually France is easier to get a mortgage than in the UK, where it's really quite difficult to get a mortgage at that age. In France, there is no sort of cut off at that early point. As long as you can qualify and you can afford the mortgage for the remaining term, it's fine. The key things to think about are what income are you going to be having to service the mortgage and how long are you planning to keep it. They would want it to be repaid by 70, 75 by most lenders. And the other key thing to really watch out for is lots of the banks will insist you take life cover, which is incredibly expensive over the age of 60. So yes, in theory, you can get a mortgage, but in practice, it's not always the most suitable option for clients, and we'll look through that with them. So there might be a scenario where we may suggest some other products for them to look at. So it's certainly not for everyone, but it is possible.
Great, okay. So a lot of the information that you've just given us in your presentation is primarily geared towards UK buyers. But what advice do you have for American or Canadian buyers or other international buyers looking to secure a French mortgage?
Yeah, okay. So if you're a British expat, you probably are virtually going to have the same number of options as I've just run through. But if you are a US citizen based in the US, it's going to be significantly restricted. A number of banks won't lend to anybody with a US connection at all. So that's going to be the most restricted. We do have some options, but on the whole, banks are wanting you to place funds with them as additional security to the property. And the hardest category is going to be a US national, citizen, and someone that's self-employed. Anything from there becomes easier. So a US person who's employed would be one step easier. A US person living in the UK would be one step easier. And we have quite a lot of options for those people. And Canadians would also be much easier. So it's really the US citizens living and working in the US, which is our hardest category, and it is changing all the time. So I would say sort of 3 or 4 months ago, we had half a dozen options for that group, and we probably now only have 1 or 2. So it's really changing. So if you're not looking to buy for the next 12 months, please do get back in touch and let me update you with what's available then.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it really is a good idea to get in touch and get specific advice for your individual situation.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we'll stop there now with the questions for Fiona, but we will be coming back to Fiona at the end. So remember, if you do still have questions, drop them in the Q&A box. And before we go over to our third speaker, I'm going to do another quick poll, which I will put up on the screen in just a few seconds when I find it. Here we go. Here it is. So the question is, why are you looking to buy in France? Are you looking to buy as a second home or a holiday home? Are you looking to move to France? Are you looking for a second home, but perhaps to retire to it one day? Are you looking to make a financial investment in France? Or are you looking to run a gîte or a similar business? So I'll give you just a minute to answer that. You're very speedy with answering, I must admit, coming in fast and furious. Okay. I'll just give you a couple more seconds. Looks like all of you have answered. Okay, I'm going to, oh no, still a few more. There we go. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there and I will share the results for you on the screen. So it looks like the majority of you are looking to move to France. However, that's closely followed by both second home or holiday home buyers and a second home to potentially retire to one day. And also a fair few of you that are looking to run a gîte or similar business, and just a few of you that are looking for financial investment. So a good mix there. But yeah, lots of you looking to move to France. Okay, right. Let's go over now to our third speaker, which is Matthew Cameron from Ashton's Legal. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Zoe. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for those comments as well from Joanna and Fiona coming before me. Really sensible comments. I'm sure we'll hear similar wise comments from Ma after me, so hopefully I'll be vaguely helpful as well. Brief introduction about me and my firm. Ashton's Legal's a medium-sized law firm in England, which puts it about 40 partners, based predominantly in East Anglia, albeit with an office in Leeds, where we bought a small niche practice in French law a couple of years ago called Heslop and Platt. So while 40 partner firm is medium in England, it's absolutely massive compared to typical notaires practices in France. A little bit about the French team at Ashton's Legal, which is based across the Suffolk and Leeds offices. I'm a solicitor and partner and head of the department. I've got a team of about 12 people, and our main sort of work is in relation to assisting British nationals when they're looking to enter into property transactions in France, be it sales and purchases or even gifting. So looking at some of those in turn, we do a lot of work in relation to property purchasing. Indeed, we've worked many times in the past with Joanna's teams across the whole of France. And we also work with the notaire to make sure that the whole contract is suitable for you. We'll address any issues that may be relevant. We'll go through the final contract documentation to make sure it's all in order. So the first contract documentation and the final sale deed to make sure all of that is in order. And in addition, we'll be looking at the inheritance law and tax issues that arise in relation to the purchase in France. It's of fundamental importance that everybody will consider in detail the implications not only of French inheritance law and tax, but also the cross-border consequences. Things that can be done in France can have disadvantages in the UK. It's not sufficient just to rely on the fact that the EU succession regulation that came into effect in 2015 allows people to choose the law of their own jurisdiction to apply to their properties in France. That doesn't take into account any inheritance tax consequences in either jurisdiction, and there are lots of reasons why, therefore, a lot of care needs to be taken in relation to inheritance law issues. And of importance, and corroborating what Fiona and Joanna have both said about making sure you do all your research well in advance, there are some estate planning structures, some ownership structures that cannot be taken into account if you already own your property in France. So these are issues that you should be considering in advance of a purchase. Similarly, we act for people when they're selling properties. We'll go through the same contract documentation, again, working alongside agents and notaires to make sure that's all in order. We'll be looking at the other issues that will arise on a sale, such as capital gains tax that might be applicable and that might come up in both the UK and in France. So we need to be careful about both sets of capital gains tax rules. And similarly, we often are invited to assist people when they're thinking about gifting their properties. That's quite popular for people who own second homes in France. They may realise that if you gift a property, it can come out of your estate for inheritance tax purposes in the UK. But there are ways of carrying out a gift that can cause lots of disadvantages for tax purposes later on. A very common form of French gifting can be beneficial for tax purposes in France, but hugely disadvantageous for tax purposes in the UK. So we need to be thinking about all of those things in the round. So that's a very brief overview of the sort of areas that we touch upon. And back to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Matthew. Right, let's jump straight into a few frequently asked questions for Matthew. First up, what are some of the common legal pitfalls buyers make when buying in France, and how do I avoid them? Okay, so as I just mentioned, one of the most important points to bear in mind, and a regular pitfall, in fairness, is when people don't take full and detailed advice in relation to the inheritance law and tax position. It really is fundamental. And it's also important to note that any advice should be tailored to your specific circumstances. It's never going to be enough just to read a few bits of information on the internet, or to listen to what somebody else has done when they're telling you about it down the pub, because it might not be suitable for you. You really do need to take detailed personal advice. Accepting a seller's suggestion that a survey isn't done in France is also potentially a pitfall. It would depend largely on your own views on risk, of course. And while it is the case that there is a set of diagnostic inspection reports that the seller has to produce, these won't necessarily go to the whole integrity of the building. So if you are, frankly, very risk averse, and you're prepared to pay the extra costs that would be generated by having an independent survey, then that will give you that peace of mind. If you are going to have a survey, it's always best to have it done before you sign the contract. So again, it's something you should be thinking about long in advance. You'll have lined up a surveyor to be ready to go and visit a property very quickly. Similarly, fully understanding the contract is of fundamental importance. Now that may seem self-evident, but of course the contracts are in French, and while a lot of the best agents will produce translations that will explain in legal English effectively what the contract contains, it won't necessarily ensure that all of your personal circumstances are necessarily covered. It won't cover what might be missing from the contract as well. So. Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. Can you explain the new French inheritance laws that came in last year and how they affect French homeowners? Does this mean foreign homeowners are no longer covered by the EU succession regulation?
Okay, so we did. I did just briefly touch on the EU succession regulation a couple of minutes ago. That's a regulation that came into effect in 2015, and in order to explain what Zoe described as the new inheritance law that came into effect on the 1st of November 2021, we really will need to look back at the impact of the EU succession regulation so that I can explain it. And so you'll have to bear with me a bit on this. The EU succession regulation, which applies to UK nationals, even though the UK is no longer a part of the EU, allows a national of another country to elect to apply the law of their nationality to estates, to assets in another jurisdiction. That means that English law of inheritance can apply to your home in France. Now, we're, I think, all relatively comfortable that under English inheritance law, we're entitled to leave our estate to anybody we may choose. We're not necessarily obliged to leave it to a spouse or to our children. We could write a will that would leave everything to the cat's home if we wanted, or to a friend down the road, subject to a few very small limitations. Now, clearly, though, that testamentary freedom, as we call it, goes against the grain of the famous French Civil Code, which reserves rights to one's children. So the new law that came into force last year works to state that where a deceased person invoked a law to apply to their inheritance that would go against that reserve that leaves assets to the person's children, then those children are entitled to raise a claim. Now, there are a number of criteria that must be satisfied before any claim could be raised. One being that the testator must be French resident or resident elsewhere in the EU, and at least one of the children must similarly be French resident or resident elsewhere in the EU. If one of those two tests is satisfied, then the notaire is obliged to contact all of the children and ask them if they are happy for a will to be executed, to be implemented, in which they would then be effectively disinherited. As a classic example, a deceased person may be choosing to leave everything to their second spouse rather than to the children. If the children were not happy with that, they would have a right to claim in liquid form, so effectively cash, against the beneficiary. So it's not going to be setting aside the will, but they have a liquid claim. It does mean in all of that that where this is only a holiday home and none of the children are resident in France or elsewhere in the EU, then there is complete testamentary freedom as before. So the deceased would have been able to have written a will that would disinherit the children if chosen. And similarly, there is a general consensus that since the new French law goes somewhat against the whole intention of the EU succession regulation, it is likely to be struck out by the European courts at some point in the near future, although that remains to be seen.
Thank you, Matthew, for shedding a bit of light on that. I know a lot of us have been a bit confused about that one. One more question for you. What do I need to know about my tax liabilities if I'm buying a gîte or renting my property in France?
Okay, well, any rental of your French property, whether it's rental to holidaymakers, whether you've entered into a leaseback scheme, whether you've got a long-term tenant in a property, will always mean that there will be a potential liability to French income tax. You will have to declare the revenue in France. That will be the case whether you are a permanent resident in France or whether you are a UK national and subject to declaring your income to HMRC in the UK. If you are a UK tax resident, you will therefore be declaring the tax or declaring the income both in France and then in the UK. You should be entitled to offset most, if not all, of the tax paid against your UK income tax under the double tax treaty. But you, again, need to be very careful about ensuring that in the first instance that you declare it in France. We've seen any number of instances where people have thought they were perfectly fine because they were declaring their income in the UK, but not declared it in France. They can then have tax inspections in France that would then generate penalties and back tax obligations. Overall, in all of that, there is every interest in ensuring that if you are going to be renting out your property in France in any form, that you should be speaking to good French accountants who will be able to talk to you about how best to structure your income tax affairs, and then talk to accountants in the UK for your UK tax return too. So.
Great, thank you, Matthew. I know there's quite a few attendees who have asked similar questions on that subject, so hopefully that has answered that for you. And we'll come back to Matthew again at the end with some more questions. Before we move on, let's do one last quick poll. Let me go grab it. Is it? Oh, I think I'm still sharing the last one. Sorry about that. Here we go. So this is more of a general question for anybody who's attending FrenchEntrée webinars or reading our magazine, coming to our website, following us on social media, etc. What are you most interested in content on? And you can select as many options as you like. So please do select multiple options if you want to. Buying French property, French tax, legal or inheritance advice, wealth management and estate planning, French mortgages, currency exchange, or moving to France and residency. Oh, and there's one more, owning and managing a second home. Right, I'll give you a minute to answer that. Lots of people saying buying French property, which is no surprise, being as this is a buying French property webinar. Also, lots of people saying French tax, legal advice, moving to France, actually all of them, to be honest, so that's good. I'll give you few more seconds to answer. Looks like almost all of you have answered by now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and every time I go to end it, somebody starts answering again. Right, here we go. So yeah, the majority, no surprise, buying French property. That's why we're all here. Lots of you about French tax, unsurprising as well, as it's such a tricky subject to understand. Legal and inheritance advice as well. A lot of you are moving to France and residency. While we're on the subject of that, we do have another webinar coming up next month. I will announce the details at the end of this webinar, but it is all about visas and residency, so you won't want to miss that one. And quite a few as well for owning and managing a second home, mortgages, currency exchange as well, which you're in the right place. So great. I will stop sharing that now. And we will go over to our fourth and final speaker of the day, which is Mar Bonin-Palmer from Moneycorp. Over to you, Mar.
Thank you, Zoe, and good morning to everyone. It's been very useful to actually hear everybody before me. Even if I've been in the industry for a long time, I always learn something new, and great to have the updates from you guys. So my name is Mar, and I am the head of partnerships at a company called Moneycorp. Moneycorp, and I'm going to share my screen. I am, just like Fiona, going to share a very brief presentation just to support what I'm talking about, not make it too boring. Right. So Monicorp is a foreign exchange specialist. We are basically an alternative to high street banks to help individuals planning the best way to exchange their funds, in this case, to buy a property in France, from the very beginning to pay the deposit, to helping you planning how to pay for the completion of the property, and then supporting you in any other payment you may have for financing, paying a mortgage, restoring or renovation, or paying taxes. We've been doing this for over 40 years, which makes us one of the longest established foreign exchange companies in the UK and one of the largest ones. Our main headquarters are in London, in the UK, but we have quite an important footprint internationally, mainly in America and in Europe. So our services are not only available to UK residents, but also to clients worldwide. The reason why I'm here is because if you buy a property in France, you will have to pay for that property in euros, and most of you are holding another currency, mainly, I believe, pounds or dollars. And at some point, you will need to exchange these funds into euros to pay for your property. The need to exchange your funds to buy your property in France creates a risk defined mainly by two factors. One is the timeline of the property transaction in France. As an average, is 2 months for a resale property from the moment that you find that property to the moment that you complete on that property. If you are buying off plan, it may be slightly longer, in which case the risk, as you will see in a second, may be a little bit higher. And the second factor is the fact that the exchange rates are constantly changing. And these fluctuations of the rates, together with the gap between finding that property and completing on that property, creates or may create a real challenge on your budget. In fact, it is unlucky, or likely rather, than the rate that you got at the beginning of your process of buying a property or finding that property. At the moment that you find that property is the same rate that you are getting at the time that you come to pay for that property. Which is like if I am saying that the price that you are paying for that property is slightly different than the price that you agree to pay for that property. So let's see the effect or the impact that exchange rate fluctuations have with a graph and a little bit or a couple of examples. This graph that I have chosen is a graph that shows the volatility or the fluctuations in between the pound and the euro in the last 3 years, more or less. I purposely have chosen to show you the last 3 years just because I wanted to show you and illustrate how sometimes substantial events like COVID or Brexit may have a massive impact on your transaction, on the rate, and therefore in your transaction. As you can see here, I put an example. COVID had a massive impact on the market and especially on the pound. From one day to the other, we saw the pound coming from rates of 120 in February 2020 to a drop of 105, which, as you can see, buying a property in France would have had an impact on a property price for someone buying a property for £250,000 of nearly 35,000 euros. So massive impact there on COVID and also on Brexit. This year, we haven't seen on the last 18 months the fluctuations that we saw back in 2022. It's been a bit more gentle, but still we have had plenty of actions in the market, mainly dictated by 3 factors. One has been the recovery of the economies post-COVID. Second one, an unfortunate one, the conflict of Ukraine, which had a real impact not only on Europe and in the UK, but also globally, and ultimately has contributed to the current energy crisis. And third, something that you see in the news these days constantly, the level of inflation that most countries are expecting or experiencing, and that is driving the interest rate decisions from major central banks, as we are seeing, especially here in the UK. Probably there's going to be an announcement now on the 22nd on that front. So as you can see in the graph, still plenty of volatility for someone buying in France. This year we have seen the higher on the pound euro at 121.90 back in March, and the lowest actually this week, I think it was on Monday when we dropped to 114. So it's still a massive impact on someone buying a property. If you hold in US dollars, which I believe some of you are in a completely different situation. The Fed was one of the first ones to raise interest rates to fight inflation. So they were ahead of the race, which gave them some advantage. But also the situation created by Ukraine and the uncertainty of recession in some of the major economies has brought some risk aversion to the market. That means that investors are now taking their money and putting their money in what we call a safe haven, such as the US dollar. And that's what we see the US dollar holding so strong. We've seen the US dollar GBP, actually, the US dollar against the pound, reaching the lowest level since 1986. And also, July 13, we saw the dollar against euro, which is quite interesting for those buying in France, reaching parity and is still holding to kind of more or less these levels. We don't know what will happen there. Experts believe that if there is a little bit of a correction on energy prices, we may see also a correction in the market, especially with the US dollar. But what is without discussion is that right now is a great time for those holding US dollars to buy euros and to buy also sterling. How to manage all of these effectively, all these fluctuations? Well, I will say my first advice is to plan in advance. It is never too early. For instance, at Monicorp, we follow the journey of the client, sometimes even before they travel to France or they found a property. Getting familiar with the rates will help you setting up your budget, and getting in contact with a company that is a specialist company will help you with no cost to understand the market and your options. Get a good rate of exchange. That sounds pretty straightforward. My advice here is don't go to your bank. High street banks will not give you a good rate of exchange. In fact, as an average, we say that the foreign exchange specialist companies such as Monicorp will represent about 2% saving in comparison with the bank. So with irrelevance of where the market is, a foreign exchange specialist may be able to show you saving and add value in comparison with the bank. Get your guidance and know your options. There is not only one way of exchanging your funds. There's different ways depending on your circumstances, your budget, your timeline. For instance, you could potentially lock a rate of exchange ahead of your completion, removing all this uncertainty that the rates may cause and locking the price to what is called a forward contract. And if you're optimistic and you think that the market may move in your favor, you could even try to target a better rate of exchange of what we have right now through what is called a market order. I don't have more time. I'm sure that Zoe is going to call me at some point, but if you have any questions, we will have some time at the end. Just a couple of final thoughts to take away with you. I mean, remember to plan. I think that Matthew has been very good also on stressing out on that point. Before you travel to France, make sure that you understand how you're going to pay for that property. Do you need a mortgage? Do you need cash? Remember on the mortgage side, I don't know if Fiona have mentioned that sometimes it's just good to have a conversation with a mortgage broker, because sometimes even if you have the cash, it's more advantage for your situations to get actually some finance. Make sure that you discuss things like, how am I going to fund that property? Do I have euros to exchange? How am I going to do that? Ownership, something that Matthew has also touched in, very important that you maybe plan this and discuss in advance of finding and even buying that property. Secondly, I will say foreign exchange is a world of regrets. And that's because after you have taken your decision and buy your currency, the rates will continue moving. So it is very important that the decision that you make works for you, for your circumstances, and for your budget. And third, most important thing, don't forget why you are buying a property in France, and try not to get very obsessed with the rates. You are not buying a property in France to speculate with currency. Most of you are buying in France because you love the country, the culture, the pace of life. And it is important to always keep this in mind and make this what it should be, an enjoyable adventure to buy a property in France. So best of luck. And with this, I'm going to pass to Zoe. I believe that some of you have some questions that may be able to answer right now and maybe at the end of the presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mar. Some really good advice there for anyone looking to buy in France. So let's tackle a few frequently asked questions for Mar. First of all, how does a forward contract work and when should I use one?
Okay, so forward contracts are one of probably the most successful or most used tools for currency or for property buyers abroad. I will say that usually you will get into a forward contract if either you need to have the certainty to know exactly how much that property is going to cost you. So people that is very restrained with their budget, that cannot really wriggle around with their budget, I will say is a good opportunity to do that. Fix it and then you remove that uncertainty. And the second reason is because maybe the rate is very good at the moment that you are paying your deposit, and you say, why not fixing the whole thing and take advantage of that rate? You need to bear in mind that there is no cost associated to a forward contract. You just need to have 10% deposit to actually fix that contract. But also it's very important to understand that once you fix it, there's no way out. So you make a commitment to buy that currency. So you need to be completely sure that that's the right decision for you.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, do I need to have a euro account or local bank account to make the payments towards the property?
You don't. In fact, this is often when clients come to us, they haven't even found the property and they are very stressed out about how can I open a bank account in France? I mean, sometimes just like in the UK, you're not going to be able to open a bank account in France until you can prove that you own a property in France or you reside in France. The important thing is that if you want to make payments in euros, you can use as for instance, you can open an account and automatically you are able to make payments and hold euros until a payment has to be released. So we give you an euro account for the time being. It's never going to substitute having a local bank account in France, which you may want to have once you own the property to pay for your mortgage, for any utility bills that you may have, and just to administer your life in France. And also another important thing, Fiona, now comes to my mind, that is just because we have a lot of people moving to France. Just remember, because I think that a couple of years ago there was in the news because of Brexit, a lot of British people moving to France that couldn't keep their UK bank accounts, and they're having difficulties to move money in between the two countries. You could, if you are moving to France, continue using your Monocorp account. We are licensed to operate in Europe, and you can have therefore a facility that allows you to hold euros, hold the sterling, and make payments in between the two countries, even if when you become a resident in France.
Brilliant, thank you. And really good tip there for British buyers in particular. Right, we'll do one more question for Mar, and then I'm going to open the questions up to everybody, and we'll get through your questions that you've been asking throughout. What advice would you give for setting your French property budget when the exchange rate keeps changing?
Well, that's a very tricky one. And again, like this world of regrets that I was talking about at the end, I think that the best thing, and this is from my own experience talking to different clients over the years, is that if when you go to France and you find that property, you look at the market and you look at the rate that you have when you put an offer, that will give you a good reference to know how much that property should cost you. Also, we'll give you a bit of reference if you want to play a little bit with the market. If I know that today I find the property and the rate is 114, then I know that anything above 114, I'm maximizing my budget, and anything below 114 may mean that my property is going to become more expensive. So if you create a range that works for you and for your budget, then it's easier then to set up your budget, talk to a dealer, see when is the best rate, when you are losing, when you are winning, and to keep an eye and make sure that you buy that property within your budget and it doesn't end up being more expensive than you were expecting.
Great, thank you, Mar. Right, I'm now going to open up the Q&As to everybody on the panel. So I'll just check I still have everybody with me. Joanna, are you still there? You can all unmute yourselves again. Matthew, do I have you?
Yes, thank you.
No, I've got Mar. Fiona, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Brilliant. Okay. Joanna, I think I've still got you on mute. I'll just ask you to unmute for me. There she is.
Hi.
Great. So lots of you have been asking your questions. I've been trying to keep on top of them and keep notes, and we're going to fire through as many of them as we can. Before we get started with them, quite a few of you have put questions that concern visas and residency, and we're not going to answer those today as we don't have a visas expert on our panel today. However, our next webinar is completely focusing on visas and residency, and it will be on Thursday, October the 13th at 4 p.m. UK time. So we've organized this webinar a little bit later to make sure that our American and Canadian audience can also join us. And we'll be answering all of your questions, or we'll try to at least, on visas and residency. So if you are looking to move to France, retire to France, etc., that's a date for the diary. I will mention it again at the end. And if you can't make that, do remember all our webinars are also available to stream for free on our FrenchEntrée YouTube channel, so you can go and subscribe to the channel as well. And that's enough for the little publicity. Okay, let's start with a question for Joanna. I've had quite a few questions that are quite similar, so I'm going to group them into one, but Bill, Philip, Richard, and I think I had somebody else as well, have all said a similar thing, which was, how much are the notaires fees when you buy in France, and what additional fees do I need to account for if I'm buying a French property?
Well, generally speaking, the properties that you'll see advertised, if they're going through an agent, will include times it's paid by the seller. But when the property is advertised, it is the law that they have to show whether it's the buyer or the seller that's paying the fees. At the end of the day, it's going to cost you the same, because if the seller's paying the fees, then they will add the fees onto the property price. So the fee for the house will remain the same. The notaires fees are based on between sort of 6 and 8% of the value of the property. So you take the agency fees off, unless of course the seller's paying them, then it's the total price, but you take the agency fees off, and then you'd be looking at sort of between 6 and 8%, depending on the region. But this will all be made quite clear to you when you sign a compromis de vente, which is like the exchange of contracts. So that will be noted of what the notaires fees is, but you'd be looking at around 6 to 8%. On top of that, there isn't any other outstanding fees that you would have to pay, unless of course you were paying separate fees for a surveyor or a solicitor in the UK, for example. But the only other fees you pay in France is the taxe foncière and the taxe habitation. Whoever's in the property on the 1st of January pays the taxe habitation for the whole year. So if you bought the property on the 3rd of January, you don't have to pay any of the taxes, because the person that owned it on the 1st has to pay them for the whole year. But the taxe foncière is pro rata. So say, for example, you bought the property in June or July, you would be responsible to pay for the last few months of that coming year. Sometimes that's done at the notaire, so the notaire will ask you for a check or some sort of payment to pay them off, because the buyer the seller would have had to have paid them, and you're basically refunding pro rata. But other than that, there isn't any other charges. So your notaire's fees will be clear at the beginning. You'll know exactly what they're going to be, and you'll know what the taxe foncière is and the pro rata rate for that. Brilliant. So it's quite straightforward, no hidden charges as such.
Great, I'm sure that's very reassuring for everyone. Okay, Fiona, I'm going to fire a few, what I hope are quick questions at you. We'll see how we get on. So Linda says, what is the typical loan period in France for a French mortgage?
So the maximum period is 20 or 25 years. Most clients take between a 15 and a 20-year term, and statistically, most people actually pay it off in less than 10 years.
Okay, brilliant. And Amanda says, I have a UK property that is rented out. Will that count as a proof of income in France, or will it count towards my proof of income?
It absolutely will. They may not take 100% of the income, but it will be counted as income, as long as you have a rental agreement and it's payable, it's declared on your UK tax return, and they can see the money coming into your bank statements.
Okay, brilliant. Good to know. And Samantha says, what are the fees linked to a French mortgage application, such as a valuation fee, etc.?
So the valuation fee is different to the UK. It's generally just covered by the bank setup fee. Fees are typically less than we're used to, so rarely are they as much as 1% of the loan amount. They may be anywhere from, let's say, 200 euros up to 1%, but they're generally probably around 500 euros, 1,500 euros, depending on your loan size. But the banks tend to do a desktop valuation or a visit, and that's included in their fee because you don't receive a copy of the report. It's very much for their own purposes. So it's not an additional cost, the valuation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Fiona. Let's go to Matthew. A question from Matthew. Let me find them. Okay, Sarah says, if we don't have any children for inheritance purposes, what happens to our property on the death of one of us or both of us?
As I mentioned previously, everybody's circumstances are always going to be different. That's why we look at people's specific cases. Where people don't have any children, then there's obviously the first likely scenario is that the first one to die would be putting everything in a will to the survivor. The survivor will then be free to leave the French property to anybody they may choose. They can write a will, be it a French will, an English will, one will covering both French and UK assets if they have them. And they would be free to leave the assets to anybody they may choose. However, and here's the big but with all of this, they would also need to be giving some thought to inheritance tax, because in the UK we're used to the fact that inheritance tax is charged at one flat rate of 40% after an initial tax-free allowance. In France, the tax rates vary depending upon the proximity of the relationship between the deceased person and the eventual beneficiary. So everything that would pass to a surviving spouse is going to be free of inheritance tax. Everything that passes to children would attract one set of tax rates as relatively advantageous. But the further away from that, the direct line down children to grandchildren and so on, the higher the tax is. So while in that particular instance, they will be able to leave anything to anybody they may choose, the real problem is going to be the eventual beneficiary could, depending on how close they were, if they were, for example, just friends as opposed to cousins or siblings, they could be paying inheritance tax at 60%. So it's worth exploring in detail.
Right, yeah, I'm starting to learn that there is always a but when it comes to French legal questions, specifically tax and inheritance. One more question for you, Matthew. Adrian says, is your service mainly suitable to UK citizens, or do you offer services for other international clients?
That's a very good question. We do act for people all over the world. We can advise on the contract documentation. We can advise on how to address French inheritance law issues and French inheritance tax issues. The only bit that of our usual advice, if you want, that we wouldn't be able to offer to, for example, a US or a Canadian national is whether there would be any implications back in the US or back in Canada. So whether there would be any US tax consequences, for example. So local advice would be needed, but we can certainly advise on the main contract processes.
Brilliant. So yeah, they'd need to get a US accountant or tax specialist for that. Brilliant. Okay, question from Mar. Let me find one for you. Here we go. Helen says, if we have several 100,000 from our business or house sale, what is the best way to transfer it to a French bank account for a house purchase? Have a feeling you're going to say Monaco.
So the money is in the UK, sorry?
I'm not sure whether she's in the UK or in another country, so maybe answer for both if there's a general answer.
It's one of the things we will cover. We have clients with sources of funds in different buckets. Some money can come from a business sale, some money can be invested in property or in bank accounts, in inheritance. So we will have an overlook. I think the advantage probably of dealing with a company like us is that we will cover all the compliance necessary to make sure that the funds that we are using are compliant for a transfer to France. And we will cover any documentation that could support that. In terms of rate, yes, I will advised to use a foreign exchange specialist rather than a bank. And I think that Helen in this case could just find out by phoning her bank. A bank will give you a one direction and probably not different options suitable for your circumstances. Plus, at least in the UK, I don't know where Helen is, high street banks are offering very poor exchange rates, which always end up costing you more money than if you would have gone to a specialist. And it's a little bit like, it's great to speak to specialist companies always, especially on a transaction as important as buying a property abroad, knowing with who you have to speak about mortgages, about currency, getting the right legal advice, because otherwise at the end that can be very costly. So, and most of the times, especially in my instance with Monicorp, it doesn't cost you any money to have a conversation with us, have a bit of an initial assessment about where is your money, what is the best strategy maybe to plan in exchanging and transferring that money to France. We'll be able to have this conversation with you, and then you can decide what is the best company, or if you want to use your bank or want to use another company.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ma. One more question for you, Ma, whilst I have you. Janet says, what does it cost to have a Monicorp account, i.e. what are the rates and fees?
Okay, there is no cost on opening an account with Monicorp or obligation. So I always try to get the clients to open the account actually before they even find the property, just to take the full advantage of speaking to someone and understanding the market. Now, then when it comes to buying the currency, whether you use Monicorp or someone else, you need to take into account that you may find companies or banks that are charging you transfer fees to make the transfer. So that means to move physically the money from where you have it to France. And also, then they will charge you what it calls a margin on the rate. That's the two costs that you need to bear in mind. We don't charge transfer fees in Monicorp, but we do charge a margin. That's how we make our profit. Probably the difference is that whilst the margin for a high street bank is 2%, our margins are much lower, so the saving is always there. But if some of you are wondering how we make our money, if we don't charge anything, we do make our money from the rate. We are able, just because we don't do anything else but foreign exchange, buy the rate from the open market at very good price, pass a saving to our clients, and still make a profit. But there is no transfer fees of commission involved.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for clearing that up. Let's go to a question for Joanna. So Martin says, it seems quite confusing that in the UK, most properties are listed with just one agent, whereas in France, it seems like many properties seem to be on with lots of different agents. Is this common in France? And if it is, how would you recommend choosing which agent to go with?
Well, that really depends if you're buying or selling as well. For example, we are a British agency based in France. However, 50% of our business is to French and 50% is international. So we're selling to a lot of Americans, Dutch, Germans, clients from all over the world. It's kind of changing. It used to be that, you put your property on with a local shop that was in the local area, because bearing in mind, France can be quite rural in certain areas. So you put it on with a local, in case somebody was driving through. But generally speaking now, sort of 80% to 90% of property searches are made online. So with the opening up of the internet, when I first started, it was really in its infancy and people would go to high street shops, but that's kind of changed. So a lot of people will put a property on exclusively these days with an agency for maybe 3 months. But bearing in mind that, a lot of people are buying internationally, unless you're the French local market, then you will buy just, perhaps through one agent. But with us, obviously, we're selling internationally. So we do get a lot of exclusives, and there's also the language barrier. So people may put it on with a French agent, perhaps a German agent, perhaps a Dutch agent, because of the language thing as well. So that makes a big difference. In the UK, you'd probably have, the same agent because there isn't the language barrier, and obviously properties are all the same in the same street. But France, they're very, very different. So it really depends. You can possibly find the same property on with different agents, but usually it will be around about the same price depending on the agent's fees, of course, and then some agents do a lot more than others. So again, it can vary, but generally speaking, I would try to use a reputable agent. You can buy privately, and if you are buy privately, I would highly recommend using somebody like Matthew to help you through the sales process, because obviously you're dealing with someone privately and not going through an agency. But yeah, that they do. It is quite common in France that you could have the same property could be on with 3 or 4 agents for different reasons. But in finding an agent, you know, just look at the websites, look at the reputation, you know, speak to the agents, particularly if you're selling, to see what marketing they're actually going to be doing for you. And if you're buying, how much they're going to actually help you through that buying process. Hope that helps.
Yeah, really good advice there. Thank you, Joanna. Let's have a question for Fiona. First of all, let me just find it. Is the location of the property in France an issue? We've been advised that banks are unlikely to offer a French mortgage on a rural property. Is there any truth to that?
It's an interesting one. So we deal with banks that lend across France, and then we deal with banks that lend locally in a particular area. So we have a sort of combination. There are some banks that don't lend very much, that are only going to lend in the key areas, such as Paris or Nice, or perhaps particular areas, and they don't feel they know the other areas well enough. If a property is particularly rural, sometimes the banks are concerned with how liquid that market is, so the loan to value may be reduced. So it really will vary from bank to bank. So just as there may be more lenders in a particular area, such as the Alps, that lend to non-residents because of the sheer volume of people there, there's more sort of local banks that will be lending. In some areas of rural France, there may not be. So it might just be that wherever the person is looking, there may just be limited options. But I would recommend speaking to a specialist who will be able to tell you what the options are in terms of the bank. So there may be some truth in it, but I would hope that we have banks that will lend all across France, regardless of the location.
Okay, great. Thanks for clearing that up. Another one for you, Fiona. I've had quite a few questions that are very similar, so I'll try and group them together. But the general question seems to be, if one part of a marriage or partnership, it has EU citizenship, does that have any implication, or does it make it easier to get a mortgage, or does it not change things at all?
Yeah, we get asked that a lot. It doesn't really change things at all, because actually the Brits are the sort of largest group of buyers in France outside of the French. And so all banks that are lending to non-residents want to lend to Brits. And that's where they found those 2 categories that I mentioned earlier, post-Brexit, that they can continue to lend to. So really, if someone has an Irish passport or another European passport, it doesn't significantly change the options that are available. Actually, the most options are available to the people that are resident in the UK.
Oh, that's interesting. And would that perhaps be more of interest to American buyers, who, if, for example, one like a spouse was an EU citizen?
Yes, that is where it would be. So, for example, we have scenarios sometimes where we'll have a spouse, or one of them is American, one is British, and therefore that does really help us, because we know that there's a limited sort of appetite for US citizens. But equally, if a US citizen is resident in the UK, that we have many more options, so that can sometimes help. But it really does depend, a bit like Matthew was saying, it's so personal. Lots of this advice, it's really difficult to give without knowing the exact circumstance. But if someone is, as long as there's some sort of link to the EU, some residency, but having an Irish or Italian passport actually isn't going to massively open up your options. In fact, in some scenarios, products such as interest only would only be available if you're a Brit. So they wouldn't be available for other passport holders.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting. And I suppose it just goes to highlight how important it is to get that personalized advice before you move ahead with it. Right, Matthew, let's find a question for you. I have lots and lots. I just need to decide one. Let's try this one, should be reasonably easy. Sam says, if I'm retired, is there a threshold in France before you pay tax? I'm assuming he means if he's retired in France.
That's presumably for income tax purposes. I wouldn't really be able to answer that question. Right. That's something that'd have to come, I'm afraid, to an accountant. Perhaps that's something for a future discussion.
Yeah, okay, sorry, that's more of a more of a question for a French accountant. You also, there's a few people have asked questions about structural surveys, because you mentioned this in the presentation before, and they want to know whether this is something you'd recommend. At what point would this take place in the buying process? Is this something that you can help with, or and is there a lot of No, that's it, I think.
Okay.
Together.
Well, we do generally recommend that people would have a structural survey on their property. The analogy that I tend to make is that if somebody was buying a holiday home on the Suffolk coast, if they were a Brit buying a holiday home, they would almost certainly have a structural survey on that property. It's the same money that they're going to be spending. They're just going to be spending it in France. If they were sufficiently cautious to carry out a survey on a British property as a British national, then there's no reason why they shouldn't do the same thing in France. As I did explain, there are some diagnostic inspection reports that have to be carried out by the seller. They are very strict in what they reveal and what they look at. So they won't, for example, go to give an overview of, shall we say, the whole integrity of the property and its general solidity. So there is an interest for those who are sufficiently cautious to have a survey. There are surveyors who can carry out those sort of those sort of structural surveys. They should be done before the contract is signed. There is some information about potential surveyors through links on our website. I think something that we've mentioned on our free guide is also available on our website as well.
Okay, brilliant. And one more question for you, Matthew. Linda says, is there an equivalent in France to UK stamp duty that we need to consider?
Yes, and that's something that Joanna mentioned previously. The stamp duty is generally wrapped up within the notaire's fees. We tend to, being lawyers, being overly cautious, are on the side of caution and suggest that most people should anticipate that the notaire's fees would be about 8%, but that would actually include the stamp duty.
Right, okay, brilliant. Let's move to Mar. Let me find a question for you. Sam says, we are Australians. Are there any issues in converting Australian dollars to euros or any additional fees for Australians transferring funds to a French bank?
No difference at all. Same, absolutely same service. I haven't spoken about the Australian dollar and obviously the volatility there, but it's exactly same thing. It is not treated different. They can open an account also and transfer the funds. There's no extra fees, just the time difference. It means that normally transfers from there take a day longer. That's the only difference, but no, not at all.
Okay, great. That's reassuring to know. And we have somebody else who asked, can regular payments be used like a savings account for future use? I assume she means can your Moneycore account, can you make regular payments to your Moneycore account kind of like a savings account for future use? Is that something that people...
You can use the Moneycore account to actually pay money in and hold euros if that's what you want. So what we have is that some people is building a wealth in euros, let's say, taking advantage of the rates or sending money regularly to that euro account. However, you need to bear in mind that because the account with Moneycore is a transactional account that needs to have availability of funds at any time, it doesn't produce any interest. So I wouldn't advise anyone to hold necessarily euros unless they are waiting for a payment. Or for instance, talking about Australia, a lot of people moving to Australia, for instance, is opening an account to accumulate the Australian dollars before they have a local bank account. So unless you are trying to wait for your local bank account to open, or you want to take advantage of the rate and start accumulating wealth on that particularly currency, I wouldn't advise to hold money on a foreign exchange provider account, expecting anything in return. I know that banks don't give us that much these days, but there's no interest there. But certainly it's something that I didn't cover in my presentation. We cover a small amounts of money also. So if after you have bought the property, you need to pay for a mortgage or just send money regularly to France through regular payments to sort out any payments that you need to do in France or any costs that you have in France, you can also use the service and even create a direct debit from the UK to pay for that regular payments. But there is no saving return if that is the question. So I wouldn't use it for that purpose.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Mar. Right, we've got 5 minutes left. So let's do one more question for each of our panel, starting with Joanna. Let me find one. So Richard says, I've been looking to buy in France for around 6 months, and I've noticed that the market moves at incredible speed. Properties seem to go in a blink of an eye. As someone who is looking from the UK, what advice can you offer to be in a competitive position to buy?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the property market is extremely strong in France. You know, it's not just for the British buyers, it's for the French themselves. The domestic market is very, very strong. I would make sure, as I said earlier, you know, to get your finances in place. If you're looking for a mortgage, get something agreed in principle if you can, to make sure you know how much you're going to be able to transfer, because you know, as Mar explains, if the interest rate drops or goes up, it will affect the price of the property. So get your money held, I say, at a certain rate. We did, you know, during COVID, for example, 25% of our sales were done virtually. So everything with DocuSign and proxy signing, you can do things without visiting the property. We have a lot of Americans and a lot of Australians that physically can't get here. So what we do is we either go and video the property or we do walk rounds. We are able to do that. So your agent can go to the property, we do virtual tours, we can do live tours, you know, visiting it that way. If the property is for you and you just physically can't get there, we can do that. But the most important thing is, if you're viewing a property, make sure your finances are in place. You know, speak to, for example, Matthew, if you've got legal issues, you want to set it up as a business, you've got inheritance issues, then sort all of that out first, so that when you come to put in an offer, you're in such a strong position. And, you know, if we're negotiating that sale for you and there's another buyer that might be interested and you're ready to go, it makes a huge difference. You know, gone are the days where the properties were on the market for 6 months to a year. You know, the property market does move quickly. So do all your research beforehand, get your finances in place, and then it's so much easier for us to negotiate on a deal for that particular property. Hope that helps.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Joanna. Really good advice. And she's absolutely right. It is very quick moving at the moment. So Fiona, final question for you. Is it possible to get an interest-only mortgage in France?
Yes, it is. If you are a British resident or a Brit, then it absolutely is. Maximum loan to value currently of 70%. So you need to have a 30% deposit plus all the buying costs. The criteria is stricter than for a repayment mortgage. You need to show that you've got plenty of liquidity to be able to qualify. And the terms are slightly shorter. So the maximum term available is 14 years, but you can fix the rate for the life of the loan. So you do still have that reassurance. So yes, they're available, but the criteria is very strict. So you need to speak to us to make sure that you're going to qualify.
Great, thank you, Fiona. Right, Matthew, a final question for you. Can I add a clause to the compromis de vente, so the initial sales contract on a French property, and how does that work?
Okay, one of the things that we would generally be doing is discussing with everybody what their specific needs are, and certainly where there is a need to include extra clauses in the contract, they should be negotiated from the very outset. If there are specific concerns, they should actually be disclosed right at the start, even with an agent, to explain exactly what it is that you are looking for and what is really important to you. For example, and a relatively common example would be somebody who needs to develop a barn into a gîte for rental purposes, for example. If that is the case, then they should be declaring that at the very outset. They can then look to include an extra condition that some sort of administrative approval would be given, that planning permission would be granted. However, it's also for the seller to refuse such a condition, because requiring planning permission or any sort of legal or administrative authorization is likely to add a bit more doubt into the whole transaction. And as I think we've all been hearing today, the market is very strong in favor of the sellers. So if a seller has a person who's happy to buy without any conditionality whatsoever, they're more likely to go to them. But on the other hand, if it's extremely important for you to have any specific sort of conditionality in a purchase so that you could get out of the purchase without penalty if for any reason something goes wrong, then yes, absolutely look to negotiate them in. So you can try to get the clauses in, but there's no guarantee that the seller's going to accept.
Okay, brilliant. Great advice, Matthew. Right, we're going to squeeze in one final question with Ma. Is there a way to set up a rate tracker if I have a desired exchange rate in mind?
Yes, you can. You can set up a rate tracker. I would say that in this particular case, it's again always useful to speak to someone rather than just like use Google and say, I'm a market expert, I'm going to put the rate tracker. Reason why is sometimes clients are asking me, what difference does it make to speak to a dealer? Well, we don't have a crystal ball to know what is going to happen, but certainly the dealers at Monicorp have a lot of information about what is happening in the global markets and what information comes up. For instance, the 22nd of February of September, that I have mentioned that there is an announcement for the Bank of England on interest rates. There's an expectation that that may move the rate. And this is quite an obvious one, but there is releases of data every day that affect the market. So it's always good to know where we are, where it's likely to be. And then on that basis, you can then try to track a rate that is realistic and covers the expectations, rather than having an expectation of maybe everybody wants to buy euros at 121. Are we going to achieve 121 in the time that you have? So it's always good to have a bit of an understanding about what is happening in the market, where we've been, where we have been, and what is likely to happen, and then set up, as I said at the beginning, a kind of a range where you feel comfortable. And on that range, you can perfectly try to go for a higher rate expectation through a rate tracker or through what I call a market order that is a little bit more secure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ma. And yeah, I think if we've learned one thing today, it's how invaluable having that expert advice from the specialists in their field really is. And I hope this webinar today has helped you start on that journey and answer some of those questions. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to all of you who attended, and thank you once again to our panel for giving up their time and answering all your questions today. If we didn't get around to your questions, there were a lot of them, so we haven't answered all of them. We will forward those questions on to the relevant panelists, and if you have any additional questions or you want to get in touch with any of today's panelists, send us an email at webinar@FrenchEntrée.com. If you enjoyed today's webinar, keep an eye out for more FrenchEntrée webinars over the coming months. I know I mentioned it earlier, we finally have a date for a highly requested visas and residency webinar, and that will be taking place on October 13th at 4 p.m. UK time. So make sure you sign up for that one too, and the details of that are up on the FrenchEntrée website right now. And finally, do let us know what you thought of today's webinar. Did you enjoy it? What topics would you like to see us cover in upcoming webinars? You can drop us an email at webinar@FrenchEntrée.com. Thank you again to everyone for attending, and thank you one more time to our panel, and I will hopefully see you on the next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.